Briahna, what's on your radar today?
Well, Robbie, today I want to talk about some unenumerated rights. Look, the right to own a gun should not be punted to the states. Why not? Because it is a federally protected constitutional right. I think we can all agree here. No matter what the legislature in any given state believes, the Second Amendment is clear that the right to bear arms is not up to the states. Now, no right is absolute. States may constrain certain rights to protect competing rights and liberty interests, but to do so, they typically must prove the government's interests are narrowly tailored and that any law abridging protected rights achieve a compelling governmental interest. This is the basic framework of constitutional law. The right to free speech is guaranteed by the First Amendment, so no matter what any particular state legislature might think, no state can abridge speech rights unless, again, there is a compelling government interest in, say, preventing incitements to violence, and the law is narrowly tailored to meet said interest. There are different tests for commercial speech versus inflammatory speech, etc., but on the whole, even though the Supreme Court has upheld certain time, place, and manner restrictions on protests and the like, the fundamental right is protected no matter what state you live in. Now, the rationale for constitutional rights is this. Some things are considered to be so important, so fundamental, that the federal government will protect you against incursions by the state. This is true in some cases, even if those rights aren't specifically enumerated or written out in the Constitution. On multiple occasions, the Supreme Court has extended federal protection to rights by reading those rights into the text of existing constitutional amendments. Now, this is of course a fiction of sorts. The Constitution doesn't mention and couldn't begin to conceptualize many contemporary rights or the world that gave birth to them. Thomas Jefferson couldn't fathom the internet or various speech concerns that arise therefrom. The founding fathers writing the Constitution in the late 18th century could not have considered weapons as powerful as machine guns. They only had musket technology back then. Bullets, as we know them, weren't invented until 1832. But given the difficulty in amending the Constitution, people on both sides of the aisle have accepted the necessity of reading certain rights into the Constitution, lest we be governed by the dead hand of founding fathers who, though wise in some respects, lacked the understanding necessary to protect all the interests that exist in today's world. Notably, the Constitution did not protect the rights of women or minorities. When Abigail Adams asked John Adams to remember the ladies in drafting the laws, he replied, "I cannot help but laugh. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems." And when the Supreme Court upheld a state law requiring a fugitive enslaved man, Dred Scott, to be returned to his enslaver for a life of bondage, it's not surprising that there was nothing explicit in the written text of the Constitution to save him. In fact, the only constitutional text that explicitly mentioned Black people, quote, treats them as persons whom it was morally lawful to deal in as articles of property and to hold as slaves. And so, in the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court held that, quote, any person descended from Africans, whether slave or free, is not a citizen of the United States, according to the U.S. Constitution, and thus they could claim no freedom. Now, as you remember from history class, or maybe you were never taught, this decision escalated tensions between the slaveholding South and the North because some people believed that despite the text of the Constitution, human beings, even Black ones, have rights that should be protected by the federal government. In 1863, about 6 years after the Dred Scott case, Abraham Lincoln, of course, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, an act that was not constitutional and which went directly against the holding of the Supreme Court. It changed the legal status of enslaved Black people from slave to free. Now, again, the Constitution did not explicitly grant rights to Black people and in fact referenced them only as fractions of human beings for census purposes. We probably wouldn't have even gotten that much notice if Southern states didn't need to gin up their population numbers to secure more representation in the House. After all, in 1860, Mississippi was 55% Black. And yet, despite there being no textual support for it, in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln claimed constitutional authority. The Emancipation Proclamation read, "I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within the designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free. Upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God." The Emancipation Proclamation was never challenged in court. We had a war instead. The North won, and the issue of whether it was technically constitutional was sublimated to the moral question of whether it's right to keep another human being as chattel. And most of us think that was a good outcome. The right to be free from slavery is probably the most extreme example of a fundamental right, not explicit in the Constitution being read into it, but it's hardly the only one. Because the Constitution left so many people out, and because the Founding Fathers failed to predict penicillin or cars or bullets or women's equality, the Supreme Court has been flexible in using the Founding Fathers' words as a guiding principle, but not a strict limit. In fact, the Founding Fathers wanted this. They were clear that the Bill of Rights did not constitute a full list of all those rights that were constitutionally protected. The Ninth Amendment makes clear that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, the Bill of Rights is a partial list of rights, not the whole thing. In some ways, the Ninth Amendment may be the most important one. Imagine if the only constitutional rights that were protected on the federal level were those rights that are explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. The state would have an extraordinary amount of authority to regulate your most intimate conduct, well beyond the bounds of what we today consider to be freedom. Consistent with the Ninth Amendment, the Supreme Court has found, for example, that the right to travel, the right to vote, and the right to keep personal matters private are all constitutionally protected and cannot be abridged by the states, even though they were not specifically enumerated. Now, in overturning Roe, conservative justices have questioned the right to privacy on which the right to choose was founded. This implicates not just a woman's right to make medical decisions with her doctor, but also your right to marry who you want, regardless of their race or gender. It protects your right to engage in consensual sex acts in your home. It's the right to be left alone. It's a fundamentally libertarian right that resists intrusions by the government into your home, into your family life, or into your bedroom. The Supreme Court first established the right to privacy in Griswold v. Connecticut. That case protected the right of married couples to buy contraceptives. Now, to be clear, there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents states from interfering in a married couple's ability to do their own family planning. Based on the text of the Constitution, if California wanted to pass a anal-only statute, they could. But citing the Ninth Amendment, which again references unenumerated rights, the court defended what most of us understand should be a freedom protected at the national level. Think about what it would mean if we didn't have those privacy rights. In Griswold, Connecticut had tried to shut down a Planned Parenthood in the state using a 19th century law banning the dissemination of contraceptives. The state arrested Griswold and a medical doctor at the clinic. They were tried in a one-day bench trial, meaning no jury, and they were fined. They were literally locked up for handing out condoms. This is a shocking incursion into private affairs that no state should be entitled to commit. And the Supreme Court agreed, holding that they were dealing with a, quote, right of privacy older than the Bill of Rights, older than our political parties, older than our school system. Marriage is a coming together for better or for worse, hopefully enduring, and intimate to the degree of being sacred. It is an association that promotes a way of life, not causes, a harmony of living, not political faiths, a bilateral loyalty, not commercial or social projects. Yet it is in an association for as noble a purpose as any involved in our prior decisions. The choice to get an abortion is a similarly private and sacred association between doctor and patient, as is the choice to marry someone of the same sex or a different race, as Clarence Thomas presumably understands. Yet in his concurrence, he opens the door to revisiting all the privacy cases except the one that affects his own mixed-race union. But here's a reminder. The court in Loving v. Virginia protected Thomas's right to marry his white wife in part because it was horrified by the idea that the state should be intruding into bedrooms to uphold anti-miscegenation laws. just as the court in Griswold was horrified at the idea that the state should have to enter into, literally, the marital bedroom in order to enforce rules around the sexual behavior of husband and wife. That being the case, it's confusing to me how some principled conservatives can defend this decision. Dobbs. Federal laws are there to protect basic fundamental values while allowing latitude to the states to provide more, not less. The Founding Fathers wanted a federal system to avoid tyranny, not to create carve-outs where tyranny is acceptable on a local state-by-state level, whether it's slavery or banning abortions or banning guns or contraceptives. The point was to use states as laboratories for new ideas and programs, not to inflict old ideas on families who should be entitled to make their own choices. Conservatives often say we should kick the issues to the states. Let states decide. But why stop at the state level? If allowing choice on a more individualized level is a good thing, why not let families decide, individuals decide? Why advocate for policing of intimate behavior at the state level if tyranny is the fear? Now, some conservatives will say that protecting unborn babies is a legitimate state interest that must also be protected. On its face, I think this is suspicious. If you think abortion is murder, why would you leave it to the states to decide whether or not they should do a murder? If you would be, in fact, pushing for a federal ban on abortion, something that's unpopular among conservatives now, but which is being discussed among some social conservatives, like Ben Shapiro, who seems eager to impose his own depressing, dry marital practices on others. The leave it to the states argument is inconsistent with the moral argument against baby killing, and the federal ban argument is inconsistent with the libertarian belief in individual freedoms. Moreover, there are no babies in question here. I have got to remind everyone, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the case that followed Roe and the one that's really at issue, protects the absolute right to have an abortion only prior to a fetus's ability to survive outside of the womb. States can and have regulated abortions after the point of viability, when a fetus might more accurately be described as something we think of as a baby. But despite fear-mongering about late-term abortions, this new opinion is about making it possible for states to ban abortion altogether, even in the first few weeks. It's not, like Roe and Casey, an opinion about protecting a range of choices that individuals in states can avail themselves of. It is instead, like Dred Scott, a case that limits liberty rights and instead allows states to enact tyranny on a state-by-state basis. In Dred Scott, the court protected the state's right to enslave human beings. In Dobbs, the court is protecting the state's right to force a woman to give birth, even if it kills her. It's time as a country that we really nail down the difference between positive freedoms and negative freedoms. Freedoms to versus freedoms from. Freedom from state action, that's what I want, and what you should be fighting to protect. The right to make medical decisions without the police banging down your door to arrest you, or your wife, or your daughter, or your physician. Now, many people have been making comparisons between Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson and Roe, some in good faith and some in bad. Senator John Cornyn went viral, in a bad way, with a tweet that some people argued recommended a return to segregation since it compared Dobbs to Brown v. Board. Now, it's clear to me that Cornyn was not arguing that Brown v. Board, which overruled Plessy v. Ferguson and thus outlawed segregation, was bad law. His point obviously was the opposite, that sometimes overruling precedent is a good thing. Indeed, he's right. So how can you tell the difference as a freedom-loving conservative or libertarian? Well, as a libertarian, you should cheer when federal protections expand your rights and choices and be concerned when they limit them. Desegregation ended artificial limits on free association and created more freedom for more people. Those who didn't want to associate with Black people could, and some continue to make that choice. Similarly, Roe meant more freedom of choice for more people. Women who did not want to seek abortions, who find the practice immoral for religious reasons, could decline and can decline abortions after Roe. Roe wasn't a law forcing any kind of behavior, like Dred Scott was. After those cases were decided, Americans can make their own choices. Freedom of association, medical freedom. This is what's at stake. But conservative politicians have often shown a great deal of inconsistency on that score. Just look at how conservatives have repeatedly intervened when states have decided to allow physician-assisted suicide. That's because none of this is about states' rights or individual rights. It brings me no pleasure to point out that this is about a religious minority's desire to control the behavior of those who do not subscribe to their spiritual belief system. 6 of the 6 justices in the Dobbs majority are Catholic. And though these opinions are scrubbed of doctrine, it's no accident that they keep deciding cases in a way that's consistent with their own religious beliefs, not with the law. And if there's one thing that's quite clear in the Constitution, it's that no religion should be established above all others. It's literally the First Amendment. Now, pointing out a politician's hypocrisy can be boring and redundant. They're all hypocrites, Republicans and Democrats alike. But it is important sometimes to unpack hypocrisy to clearly see what the true motivations are here and evaluate what side you really want to be on. I want to make just one more thing clear. I personally don't think the Founding Fathers should be followed blindly. They were flawed human beings who did not consider me to be a person with rights under the Constitution, either as a woman or as a descendant of slavery. So I take them and their proclamations with a grain of salt. But that doesn't mean that certain Enlightenment principles, like non-establishment of religion, shouldn't be deeply treasured, or that unenumerated rights should be dismissed just because men of 200 years ago happened not to write them down.
It felt like a subtweet.
Of who?
16 and a half minute subtweet of me.
Well, what is your take, Rob?
No, look, I want all rights decided at the individual level as well, full stop. All civil rights, civil liberties, economic rights too. I think you should be deciding at the individual level.
Let's stay on Roe for a second. Does that mean that are you surprised at all by what I perceive to be a kind of ideological inconsistency where people who want a lot of personal freedoms and also are very frustrated about the mask mandates and masking and such seem not to have that same energy?
I think this is true of conservatives, sure. But it does not, just because you can think that the Constitution does not necessarily protect a right while still thinking that should be a right and that we ought to protect it. But just, I can't pretend it says something I don't think it says.
But that's kind of the point of this radar, right? That there is an amendment for this. It's called the 9th Amendment. And it was the Founding Fathers anticipating that people were going to look at this list of amendments in the Constitution. They were going to look at the Bill of Rights and say, oh, this is it. This is the whole shebang. If you claim anything else is a right, then you're off your rocker. The Founding Fathers said, no. This is what we've come up with. We're in a little bit of a hurry. We're about to do a revolution, but we're trying to get a country together. But, the door is open for other rights to be included. And over the course of American history, people with different ideological perspectives have been very happy to read in more into the Constitution on the basis that they understand some things are so crucial, so foundational, that obviously they should be protected on the federal level against incursions by the state, including any law that would have people opening up people's marital bedroom, peeking under the sheets, as did happen to the plaintiffs in Loving v. Virginia at one point, right? That we don't want that kind of world. And it's found a privacy right, it's found all kinds of rights that could not have been contemplated by the founders.
In Robbie-topia, you would have so much rights it would sicken you. There will be absolutely no state intrusion on any front, COVID-wise, personal liberty-wise, sexuality-wise, economically. It'd be great. You'd be welcome anytime, Briahna. You'd think it was fantastic.
So what do you make of this?
But we would set up the society that way. We'd write it all into the founding documents. We would constrain the government. We'd say it can't do anything. Ours are a little dicier than that.
Robbie, the argument is that there's no ability to ever write it all into the founding documents. You're never going to be able to anticipate all of the things that are going to come up.
They did change it 27 times.
They're going to come in the world. And that's another part of this that I didn't get into because I know how much you become frustrated by my lengthy radars.
Well, we got a whole show to produce here.
Part of the
Ghislaine Maxwell's just waiting for us later in the show.
She has time in her hands, believe me. Part of the issue is that we do have this Constitution, this gridlock, where it's very, very difficult to amend the Constitution in a way that I don't think that the founders necessarily anticipated either. So that being the case, no one has any issue saying, well, the Constitution obviously doesn't say everybody gets a machine gun, but we're willing to read that into it. All I'm saying is if we're willing to read in that the Second Amendment encompasses all of these kinds of weapons that none of the founding fathers could have anticipated, and given the founding fathers' myopia on some of these issues that frankly were issues at the time that they were writing the Constitution, like the rights for slaves, like the rights for women, et cetera, as you saw Abigail Adams be like, hey honey, what about me? And he was like, he thought about it and said, nah girl. So like, the fact that they are making those kind of choices then I don't think should constrain our ability to have these freedoms now. And that's all I wanted to address, because I do see a lot of people saying, well, there is no right to abortion in the Constitution. And if you want to play that game and say the only thing the government can protect you from against tyranny from the states is these little handful of bullet points, then you're basically begging for a world where you're more oppressed, not less.
Well, we got to leave it there, and we'll have more Rising right after this.